The sensation of awakening was less a sudden snap and more the gradual unfolding of a heavy velvet curtain. For Elaraen, it began with the hum, a low, resonant vibration that existed somewhere between a sound and a physical touch, radiating upward through the soles of her feet from the crystalline floor of the vessel. The ship, known as the Pale Wanderer, did not move through space with the violent propulsion of chemical rockets or the jarring fold of tearspace engines. Instead, it drifted like a seed on a cosmic breeze, guided by the gravitational eddies of dying stars and the gentle pressure of starlight against its translucent sails. Elaraen opened her eyes, watching the way the bioluminescent moss clinging to the interior ribs of the hull pulsed in synchronization with her own heartbeat. There was no urgency in the light, only a soft, emerald glow that illuminated the sprawling conservatory that made up the heart of the ship. She lay on a bed of woven silver grass, the blades cool and supple against her skin, and listened to the rhythmic respiration of the life support systems. It was a sound she had known for nearly 3 centuries, a steady, mechanical breathing that mirrored the organic life it protected. Outside the thick, panoramic windows of the observation deck, the nebula they were currently traversing looked like a spilled bottle of iridescent ink, swirled with gold and violet. There were no stars visible here, only the thick, glowing dust of a stellar nursery, a place where suns were born in the slow, agonizing crush of gravity over millions of years. Elaraen rose slowly, her movements fluid and unhurried, as if she were moving through water. She wore a simple tunic of spun spider silk, dyed the color of a twilight sky, and her feet were bare. The floor was warm, heated by the geothermal vents that tapped into the ship's small, contained fusion core. As she walked toward the center of the conservatory, the various plants began to respond to her presence. Ferns with fronds like peacock feathers unfurled to catch the ambient light, and small, floating globes of water, held together by localized surface tension fields, drifted toward her, offering refreshment. She reached out and touched one, the water cool and sweet as it dissolved against her palm, tasting faintly of mint and ozone. This was her world, a self-contained ecosystem drifting through the void, far from the noise and friction of the settled sectors. She had left the crowded moons of the inner rim long ago, seeking a peace that could only be found in the vast, empty stretches of the interstellar medium. The Pale Wanderer was not just a ship, it was a living entity, a symbiotic blend of organic matter and advanced circuitry that required constant, gentle tending. She spent her days pruning the light vines that grew along the conduits and recalibrating the sensors that mapped the invisible currents of the vacuum. It was a life of quiet repetition, a long, slow dance with the infinite, and she had never felt more at home than she did in the shadow of the great nebula. The central pillar of the ship was a massive, hollowed-out spire of obsidian glass, inside of which a pillar of liquid light rotated slowly. This was the Weaver, the navigational computer that interpreted the subtle shifts in the cosmic background radiation to determine their path. It didn't use coordinates or maps in the traditional sense. Instead, it felt for the texture of space, seeking out the smoothest paths through the turbulent energies of the galaxy. Elaraen placed her hand against the cool surface of the glass, and the Weaver responded by deepening its hum, a greeting that resonated in her very bones. She closed her eyes and let her mind merge with the ship's sensors, feeling the vastness of the nebula pressing against the hull. It was a sensory experience that was almost overwhelming, the heat of newborn stars, the cold bite of the dark matter filaments, the frantic spinning of a distant pulsar. But here, within the Pale Wanderer, all those chaotic forces were filtered and softened, turned into a gentle melody of data that she could understand. She saw the way the gas clouds were thinning ahead of them, signaling that they would soon emerge into the clear, open dark between the spiral arms. It was a transition she always looked forward to, the moment when the veil of the nebula was lifted and the true depth of the universe was revealed. A blackness so profound, it made the soul feel both infinitesimal and eternal. As she moved toward the galley to prepare her morning meal, Elaraen thought about the people she had left behind. They were likely long dead now, their lives having flared and extinguished in the time it had taken her to cross a single light year. Time worked differently out here, stretched thin by the effects of near-light-speed travel and the strange dilations caused by the Weaver's propulsion system. To the rest of the galaxy, she was a ghost, a relic of an era that had faded into myth. But to herself, she was simply the gardener of the stars, the keeper of a small flame in the cold. She harvested a handful of nutrient-rich berries from a bush that grew near the kitchen, their skins bursting with a flavor that was a mix of honey and citrus. She ate them slowly, savoring the texture, while she watched a school of small robotic maintenance drones flit across the ceiling like metallic hummingbirds. They were cleaning the dust from the light emitters, their tiny wings whirring in a soft, percussive rhythm. Everything in the ship had a purpose, and everything was in balance. There was no waste, no friction, no conflict. It was a perfect, closed loop, a tiny bubble of order in a universe of entropy. She found a deep comfort in that order, a sense of security that she had never known on the chaotic, overcrowded worlds of her youth. After breakfast, she made her way to the stern of the ship, where the great sails were housed. These sails were not made of fabric, but of a microscopically thin film of graphene and gold, spanning kilometers when fully deployed. They caught the photons emitted by distant stars, using the infinitesimal pressure of light to nudge the ship forward. Maintenance of the sails was a delicate task, requiring Elaraen to don a thin, pressurized suit and step out onto the exterior hull. She didn't mind the vacuum. In fact, she found it liberating. Outside, the only thing between her and the abyss was the transparent visor of her helmet and the magnetic tethers that kept her anchored to the ship. She moved across the hull with practiced ease, her boots making no sound in the airless environment. She could feel the vibration of the ship through her suit, a steady thrum that felt like a reassuring hand on her shoulder. The sails were currently retracted, folded into intricate, origami-like patterns against the ship's spine. She inspected the tension cables, looking for any signs of wear or micrometeoroid damage. There were none. The pale wanderer was well armored, protected by a flickering blue aurora of electromagnetic shielding that deflected most debris. Still, the check was necessary, a ritual of care that kept her mind sharp and her connection to the ship intact. While she worked, she looked down at the nebula beneath her. From this vantage point, she could see the complex structures of the gas clouds, the pillars of creation rising up like the fingers of a giant. It was a landscape of light and shadow, a cathedral built of hydrogen and helium. She felt a profound sense of gratitude for being able to witness such beauty. Most people lived their entire lives under the canopy of an atmosphere, never seeing the stars as they truly were, unblinking, piercingly bright, and infinitely numerous. Out here, the universe felt intimate, as if she could reach out and pluck a star from the sky like a ripe fruit. She finished her inspection and began the slow trek back to the airlock, her movements synchronized with the slow rotation of the ship. The pale wanderer turned once every hour, a motion so subtle it was only noticeable if one watched the stars move across the horizon. It provided a fractional amount of artificial gravity, just enough to keep her bones from becoming brittle and to ensure that the water in the conservatory didn't drift away into the rafters. It was another example of the ship's elegant design, a solution that was both functional and beautiful. Back inside, she shed her suit and returned to the conservatory. The light had changed. The pale wanderer was moving into a region of space where the nebula was thinner, and the golden light of the interior stars was beginning to bleed through the purple mist. She sat down by a small pond filled with bioluminescent fish, their scales shimmering with the same emerald light as the moss. They swam in slow, concentric circles, undisturbed by her presence. She reached into the water, and the fish nibbled gently at her fingertips, their touch like the brushing of flower petals. She spent hours this way, lost in a meditative state, her thoughts drifting as aimlessly as the ship. She thought about the nature of time and the way it seemed to pool and eddy in the deep spaces of the galaxy. She thought about the civilizations that were rising and falling on the planets she passed, their triumphs and tragedies reduced to nothing more than a flicker of light in the distance. To them, she was a star moving across their sky, a brief point of light that held no meaning. But to her, they were the ones who were fleeting, their lives too short to truly appreciate the slow, magnificent unfolding of the cosmos. As the day, or what passed for a day in the eternal twilight of the ship, drew to a close, Elaraen returned to the Weaver. The liquid light in the central spire had turned a deep, resonant amber, indicating that they were approaching the edge of the nebula. She watched as the first true stars began to emerge from the haze, their light sharp and clear against the encroaching black. They were like diamonds scattered on a sheet of black silk, each one a sun with its own potential for life and wonder. The ship began to accelerate slightly as the sails caught the full force of the stellar winds, a subtle push that she felt in the small of her back. They were heading into the great void, the empty space between the stars, where the only company would be the silence and the cold. But Elaraen was not afraid. She had the pale wanderer, she had her garden, and she had the endless, beautiful mystery of the universe to keep her company. She lay back on her bed of silver grass, closing her eyes as the ship carried her deeper into the night. The hum of the Weaver was a lullaby, a promise of safety and peace in a world that never stopped moving. The transition out of the nebula was a slow, majestic process. The clouds of violet and gold thinned, becoming tattered veils that revealed the true depth of the void beyond. For the first time in months, the pale wanderer was bathed in the unfiltered light of 1,000 suns. The conservatory seemed to come alive in response, the plants reaching upward as if trying to touch the stars themselves. Elaraen watched from the observation deck, her breath hitching at the sheer scale of the vista. There was a sense of profound clarity in the open space, a feeling that the universe was laid bare before her. She could see the distant smudge of other galaxies, each one a collection of billions of stars, separated by distances so vast they defied comprehension. It was a humbling sight, yet it didn't make her feel small. Instead, it made her feel like a part of something much larger, a single thread in a tapestry that spanned the entirety of existence. She felt a deep sense of belonging, a realization that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The ship's internal clocks chimed softly, a series of melodic tones that signaled the start of the sleep cycle. Elaraen dimmed the bioluminescent moss, leaving the conservatory in a state of soft, blue-toned darkness. She checked the Weaver one last time, ensuring that the navigational path was clear and that the life support systems were functioning at peak efficiency. Everything was as it should be. The Pale Wanderer was a masterpiece of engineering and biology, a testament to a time when humanity had sought to live in harmony with the cosmos rather than conquer it. She climbed into her bed of silver grass, the blades weaving themselves around her in a gentle embrace. As she drifted off to sleep, she could hear the faint, musical clinking of the maintenance drones as they finished their work for the day. It was a comforting sound, a reminder that she was never truly alone. The ship was her companion, her protector, and her home. And as it carried her through the silent, starlit night, she dreamed of galaxies made of light and gardens that bloomed in the heart of suns. The next morning, the ship passed near a rogue planet, a dark, frozen world that had been cast out of its home system eons ago. It was a lonely place, wandering the void without a sun to warm it, but it had a stark beauty of its own. Elaraen watched it through the sensors, seeing the jagged mountains of frozen methane and the vast, flat plains of nitrogen ice. There was no life there, only the cold and the dark, yet the planet seemed to possess a quiet dignity. It was a survivor, a wanderer like herself, moving through the universe on its own terms. She felt a kinship with the lonely world, a sense of shared purpose. They were both travelers in the great dark, witnesses to the passage of time. She directed the Weaver to adjust their course slightly, giving the planet a wide berth while still allowing her to observe it for a few more hours. It was a small gesture of respect, a recognition of the planet's silent journey. As the rogue planet receded into the distance, Elaraen returned to her gardening. She had a new project, a rare species of lunar lily that only bloomed in the presence of specific stellar frequencies. She had been nurturing the seeds for years, waiting for the ship to enter a region of space with the right kind of light. Now, as the pale wanderer moved toward a cluster of blue giant stars, the lilies were finally beginning to sprout. They were delicate, translucent things, with petals that looked like they were carved from moonlight. She spent the afternoon carefully adjusting the light filters in the conservatory, ensuring that the lilies received exactly the right amount of radiation. It was a painstaking task, but the reward would be worth it. When the lilies finally blouted, they would fill the conservatory with a scent that was said to be like the memory of a first frost, crisp, clean, and hauntingly beautiful. It was another small miracle in a life filled with them, a testament to the resilience and beauty of life even in the harshest of environments. The blue giants were magnificent, their light so intense it seemed to vibrate. They were short-lived stars, burning through their fuel with a reckless intensity that made them look like beacons in the dark. The pale wanderer skirted the edge of the cluster, the sails shimmering with a fierce sapphire light. Elaraen could feel the energy of the stars pressing against the ship, a powerful, exhilarating force. It was a reminder of the raw power of the universe, the incredible forces that shaped the galaxies and gave birth to life. She stood at the window, her face bathed in blue light, and felt a surge of wonder. This was why she had left the inner rim, why she had chosen this life of solitude and exploration. There was so much to see, so much to experience, and she had all the time in the world to see it. The pale wanderer moved on, leaving the blue giants behind, and Elaraen returned to her silver grass bed, the scent of the lunar lilies beginning to fill the air. It was a good day, a day of light and growth and discovery, and she knew that tomorrow would bring even more wonders as the ship continued its endless journey through the weaver of gossamer light. The passage into the open expanse beyond the blue stellar nurseries brought with it a shift in the ship's internal geometry, a subtle expansion of the living quarters that occurred whenever the external pressure of radiation dropped below a certain threshold. Elaraen watched as the walls of the conservatory seemed to breathe, the silverwood latticework sliding silently along hidden tracks to reveal alcoves that had been tucked away during the denser navigation of the nebula. This was the pale wanderer's way of acknowledging the safety of the deep void, providing more room for its inhabitant to wander, while the exterior environment remained a predictable, empty velvet. The air inside the ship grew cooler, scented now with the sharp, crystalline perfume of the blooming lunar lilies, which had opened their petals fully to the distant, pinprick light of the galactic core. Each blossom was a masterpiece of biological engineering, their veins pulsing with a soft, bioluminescent milk that mirrored the patterns of the constellations visible through the overhead glass. Elaraen spent the first few days of this transit period simply observing the lilies, fascinated by the way they turned their heads in unison toward the strongest gravitational source, a collective mechanical prayer to the unseen forces that governed their trajectory. As the ship moved deeper into the silent plains between solar systems, the work of maintenance shifted from the external hull to the delicate internal sensors that monitored the ship's psychological resonance. The Pale Wanderer was equipped with an empathetic interface, a series of copper-threaded tapestries hung throughout the living areas that changed color based on the emotional state of the passenger. Lately, The tapestries had settled into a shade of soft lavender, indicating a state of profound equilibrium. Elaraen ran her fingers over the threads, feeling the slight warmth generated by the microprocessors woven into the fabric. It was a strange sensation to have one's internal state reflected back in the decor of a room, but she found it more comforting than invasive. It was a reminder that the ship was not just a vehicle, but a partner in this long journey, a witness to her thoughts and a guardian of her peace. She spent hours in the library, a circular room lined with shelves of physical books made of synthetic vellum that would never decay. These were not digital files, but tangible objects, their weight and texture providing a necessary grounding in a world where almost everything else was ephemeral and fluid. She pulled a volume from the shelf, its cover embossed with the likeness of a world that no longer existed, and settled into a chair that molded itself perfectly to her form. The chair was made of a memory foam derivative that held the heat of her body, creating a microenvironment of warmth that made the vastness of the space outside feel less daunting. The book told the history of the early terraformers, the men and women who had first ventured out into the dark to seed life on barren rocks. They had been a different breed of people, driven by a restless energy and a desire for expansion that Elaraen found difficult to relate to. To her, the universe was not something to be conquered or transformed, but something to be experienced and respected. She preferred the philosophy of the weavers, the architects who had designed ships like the Pale Wanderer to move through the stars without leaving a trace, like a needle passing through silk. They believed that the greatest achievement of any civilization was to exist in such perfect harmony with the environment that the two became indistinguishable. While she read, the weaver began to hum a new frequency, a complex series of notes that indicated they were approaching a gravitational lens, a region of space where the mass of a distant, invisible cluster of dark matter was warping the light of the galaxies behind it. Elaraen closed her book and made her way to the observation deck, where the visual distortion was already beginning to manifest. The stars ahead of them were no longer points of light, but elongated arcs, glowing ribbons that spiraled around a central point of absolute blackness. It was a visual representation of the invisible structure of the universe, a glimpse into the hidden scaffolding that held everything together. The Pale Wanderer accelerated as it entered the outer edge of the lens, the sails catching the concentrated light like a paraglider catching a thermal. The sensation of speed was absent, as there were no fixed points of reference, but Elaraen could feel the increase in the ship's vibration, a sense of purposeful momentum that made the air in the conservatory feel charged with static. She spent the next several cycles monitoring the lens crossing, a task that required her to interact directly with the weaver's primary core. She sat in the center of the obsidian spire, her legs crossed, her hands hovering just inches from the liquid light. By moving her fingers through the air, she could manipulate the gravitational sensors, fine-tuning the ship's approach to ensure they didn't get pulled too deep into the well. It was a delicate process, a conversation conducted in the language of mathematics and intuition. She could feel the weight of the dark matter cluster, a massive, silent presence that tugged at the ship with an almost magnetic persistence. She countered it with subtle adjustments to the sail tension, balance and counterbalance, until the Pale Wanderer was sliding along the very edge of the distortion, gaining velocity without losing control. It was an exhilarating experience, a moment of high-stakes navigation that broke the long stretches of quiet reflection. Once they had cleared the lens and the stars had returned to their natural shapes, a sense of deep stillness settled over the ship. The weaver returned to its low, amber hum, and the lavender tapestries deepened into a shade of indigo. Elaraen felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her, the physical and mental toll of the navigation finally making itself felt. She retreated to the galley and prepared a tea made from the dried leaves of the silver grass, the liquid clear and smelling of rain. She took the cup to the upper balcony of the conservatory, where she could look down at the entire ecosystem. From here, the pale wanderer looked like a cathedral of glass and greenery, a tiny oasis of life in a desert of vacuum. She saw a pair of maintenance drones working on a faulty light emitter, their movements slow and methodical, and she felt a sudden, overwhelming affection for the machines. They were the silent workers who kept her world functioning, the unsung heroes of her long voyage. The following weeks were marked by a period of intense creative output. Inspired by the patterns she had seen in the gravitational lens, Elaraen began to work on a series of sculptures made from a programmable resin that responded to touch. She spent her afternoons in the workshop, her hands covered in the translucent goo as she shaped it into miniature versions of the light arcs and spirals she had witnessed. As the resin hardened, it retained a faint phosphorescence, glowing with the same golden light as the weaver. She placed the finished pieces around the conservatory, tucking them among the ferns and the lilies, where they looked like strange, alien artifacts that had grown out of the soil. It was a way of marking her journey, of leaving a physical record of the things she had seen. She knew that no one else would ever see them, but that didn't matter. The act of creation was its own reward, a way of processing the immense beauty of the cosmos and turning it into something tangible and small. One evening, while she was tending to the fish pond, she noticed a change in the behavior of the bioluminescent fish. They were no longer swimming in circles, but were huddling together near the center of the pond, their lights flickering in an erratic, nervous pattern. Elaraen frowned, sensing a disturbance that the ship's sensors hadn't yet picked up. She walked to the observation deck and looked out at the stars, but everything seemed normal. It wasn't until she checked the long-range thermal scanners that she saw it, a faint, pulsing heat signature several light-years away. It was too small to be a star and too regular to be a natural phenomenon. It was a signal, a rhythmic burst of energy that repeated every few seconds, a lighthouse in the dark. She felt a sudden chill, a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. In all her years of travel, she had never encountered another artificial signal. The pale wanderer was far off the beaten path, in a region of space that was supposed to be empty. She returned to the weaver and began to analyze the signal, her fingers flying through the liquid light. It wasn't a distress call, nor was it a communication. It was simply a pulse, a heartbeat of energy that seemed to be coming from a fixed point in space. She mapped the coordinates and found that the signal was originating from a small, unremarkable star system on the very edge of the galactic rim. There were no recorded colonies there, no mining outposts, no research stations. It was a place that the charts simply ignored, a blank spot on the map of the galaxy. Elaraen hesitated, her hand hovering over the navigation controls. Part of her wanted to ignore the signal and continue on her planned path, to maintain the perfect, isolated peace she had built for herself. But another part of her, the part that had first ventured into the stars, was stirred by the mystery. What could be out there, so far from everything else, sending a pulse into the void? She spent the next few hours in a state of indecision, pacing the length of the conservatory. The lavender tapestries had turned a mottled gray, reflecting her internal conflict. She looked at the lunar lilies, their petals closed tight against the night, and then at the distant, pulsing signal on the monitor. Finally, she made her decision. She reached into the weaver's core and adjusted the sails, banking the pale wanderer into a long, slow curve that would take them toward the source of the signal. It was a detour that would add months to her journey, but she knew she couldn't pass it by. The universe had offered her a mystery, and it would be a betrayal of her nature to refuse it. As the ship turned, the light of the stars shifted across the floor, and Elaraen felt a new sense of purpose. The long, drifting dream of her voyage had been interrupted, replaced by a tangible goal. The journey toward the signal was quiet and uneventful, but the atmosphere inside the ship had changed. There was a sense of anticipation, a subtle tension that made the air feel sharper. Elaraen spent more time in the workshop, her sculptures becoming more complex and abstract. She found herself thinking more about the people she had left behind, wondering if any of them had ever felt a similar pull toward the unknown. She remembered a story her grandfather had told her about the first explorers, how they had set out in ships that were little more than tin cans, driven by nothing but a desire to see what was on the other side of the horizon. She had always thought of them as reckless, but now she understood them a little better. There was something intoxicating about a mystery, something that called to the deepest parts of the human spirit. As they drew closer to the source, the signal became clearer and more defined. It was a complex sequence of frequencies, a mathematical pattern that was undeniably artificial. The Pale Wanderer's senses began to pick up more detail about the destination, a small yellow star with a single rocky planet in its habitable zone. The planet was unremarkable at first glance, a barren world with no atmosphere and no signs of life. But as they entered the system, Elaraen saw that the signal wasn't coming from the planet itself, but from an object in orbit around it. It was a massive, skeletal structure, a ring of metal and glass that spanned hundreds of kilometers. It was an ancient megastructure, a piece of engineering from a civilization that had vanished long ago. It was beautiful and terrifying, a ghost of a world that had once been filled with life and energy. The Pale Wanderer approached the ring slowly, its sails shimmering in the light of the yellow star. Elaraen stood at the observation deck, her eyes wide as she took in the scale of the structure. It was covered in a layer of dust and micrometeoroid craters, a testament to the eons it had spent drifting in the dark. Yet it was still functioning, its central core still pulsing with the energy that had called to her across the light years. She felt a sense of awe, a realization that she was looking at something that had existed long before her ancestors had even learned to walk upright. It was a reminder of the vastness of time and the fragility of civilization. She directed the Weaver to bring the ship into a stable orbit alongside the ring, her heart racing as she prepared to investigate. The ring was silent, a graveyard of technology and dreams. But as Elaraen looked out at the massive structure, she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. In one of the intact glass domes that dotted the ring's surface, there was a light. It wasn't the cold, artificial light of a computer core, but the soft, warm glow of a bioluminescent garden. Someone or something was still alive in the heart of the ghost ship. She felt a surge of hope, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. She wasn't alone in the dark. There was another traveler, another gardener of the stars, waiting for her in the ruins of the past. She began to prepare her suit, her movements quick and efficient. The long, drifting piece of her journey was over, but a new chapter was about to begin. The Weaver hummed a low, expectant note, and the lavender tapestries turned a bright, vibrant gold. The approach to the derelict ring was a study in profound stillness, a transition from the fluid motion of the open void to the rigid, silent geometry of ancient engineering. Elaraen watched through the primary viewing port as the Pale Wanderer matched its velocity to the rotating megastructure, the ship's magnetic grapples extending like the cautious limbs of a deep-sea creature. The ring was a colossal lattice of carbon nanotube girders and silvered hull plates, many of which had been scoured dull by eons of solar wind and micrometeorite impacts. It didn't possess the organic curves of her own vessel. It was a relic of an era defined by grandiosity and the defiance of physics. As the ship drew closer, she could see the vast, empty bays where smaller craft must have once nested, now nothing more than gaping maws filled with shadow. The light from the yellow sun hit the structure at a sharp angle, casting long, jagged shadows across the interior curve of the ring, creating a landscape of artificial mountains and valleys that seemed to stretch into infinity. Despite the decay, there was a haunting elegance to the ruin, a reminder that even the most ambitious works of sapient beings were eventually reclaimed by the slow crawl of time. She secured her atmospheric suit, checking the seals with a methodical precision that calmed her racing pulse. The suit was a second skin, woven from the same bioluminescent fibers that lined the ship's corridors, designed to provide protection without sacrificing tactile sensitivity. She bypassed the standard airlock, opting instead for the umbilical bridge, a flexible, pressurized tube that could extend and dock with the ring's ancient surface. The Weaver provided a steady stream of data to her HUD, translating the ring's faint internal vibrations into a visual map of structural integrity. There was still a thin atmosphere within certain sectors of the ring, kept stable by localized gravity generators that refused to fail. It was a testament to the redundancy of the original design, a machine built to outlast its creators by millions of years. When the umbilical finally latched onto a docking port, the sound was a dull, metallic thud that resonated through the pale wanderer, a handshake between two eras of spaceflight. Stepping into the ring was like walking into a cathedral of glass and cold. The air was stale, tasting of recycled oxygen and the faint, metallic tang of ionized dust, but it was breathable. Elaraen moved through a series of transit corridors where the walls were covered in a fine layer of rime, the moisture from the failing life support systems having frozen into intricate patterns of frost. Her boots made no sound on the floor, which was made of a material that felt like polished bone. She followed the coordinates of the pulsing signal, her path illuminated by the dim, flickering emergency lights that still clung to life in the ceiling. As she moved deeper into the structure, she noticed that the walls were etched with complex friezes depicting a history she didn't recognize, star charts of systems that had long since drifted apart, and figures in robes who seemed to be tending to giant, glowing spheres. It was a silent chronicle of a people who had seen the universe as a garden to be cultivated, a philosophy that mirrored her own, but on a scale that was almost terrifying. The corridor eventually opened into a massive atrium, a space so large that clouds had formed near the distant ceiling, shedding a light dusting of snow onto the floor. In the center of this atrium stood the glass dome she had seen from the ship, a shimmering bubble of life amidst the desolation. Inside the dome, the greenery was lush and chaotic, a riot of colors that defied the gray gloom of the surrounding station. There were trees with leaves like translucent emeralds and flowers that glowed with a fierce, internal fire. But it was the inhabitant of the garden that drew her attention. Sitting on a stone bench near a bubbling fountain was a figure clad in robes of shimmering gray, their back to her, seemingly lost in thought. There was no movement, no sign of life other than the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of their shoulders. Elaraen hesitated at the edge of the dome, her hand resting on the seal of the airlock door. She felt a sudden wave of trepidation, a fear that by entering this space, she would shatter the fragile peace that had existed here for untold ages. She pressed the control panel, and the door slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss. The air that rushed out was warm and humid, smelling of damp earth and blooming jasmine. The figure on the bench turned slowly, and Elaraen found herself looking into eyes that were the color of a fading nebula, pale violet, and filled with an ancient, weary wisdom. The stranger was not human, though the resemblance was striking. Their skin had a faint, pearlescent sheen, and their hair was a cascade of fine, silver filaments that seemed to catch the light from the glowing flowers. They didn't look surprised to see her. Instead, there was a flicker of recognition, as if they had been expecting a guest for a very long time. The stranger rose, their movements even slower and more deliberate than Elaraen's own, and gestured toward the bench. There were no words spoken, but the intent was clear. This was a place of respite, a sanctuary at the end of the world, and she was welcome. Elaraen took a seat, the stone bench surprisingly warm beneath her. Up close, She could see that the fountain was not filled with water, but with a liquid light that flowed like honey, cascading over a series of carved obsidian basins. The sound it made was a soft, tinkling chime, a music of pure geometry. The strangers sat beside her, their presence radiating a sense of profound calm that dampened the anxiety in Elaraen's chest. For a long time, they simply sat together in the warmth of the garden, watching the artificial snow fall outside the glass dome. It was a shared moment of silence that felt more profound than any conversation. In the absence of language, they communicated through the shared experience of the garden, the scent of the flowers, the warmth of the light, the steady rhythm of the fountain. Elaraen felt her connection to the pale wanderer stretching thin, replaced by a new, local connection to this ancient place and its lonely guardian. Finally, the stranger reached out and touched a small, crystal tablet resting on the bench between them. The tablet projected a holographic image into the air, a map of the galaxy, but one that looked fundamentally different from the ones Elaraen knew. The stars were arranged in complex, interconnected webs, like the neurons of a vast cosmic brain. The stranger pointed to a specific node on the web, a point of light that throbbed with the same rhythm as the signal that had led her here. Then they pointed to Elaraen, and then to the pale wanderer docked outside. The message was clear. She was part of this web, a traveler on a path that had been laid out long before she was born. The signal hadn't been a distress call, it had been a beacon, a way of drawing the scattered threads of the weaver's legacy back together. She realized then that she was not just a lone explorer, but a participant in a grand, slow-motion gathering of those who cared for the light. The stranger began to manipulate the holographic map, showing her the history of the ring and the civilization that had built it. They were called the Shapers, a people who had dedicated themselves to the preservation of planetary ecosystems across the quadrant. They hadn't been conquerors or even colonists in the traditional sense. They were stewards, guardians who moved between the stars to ensure that life had the chance to bloom. The ring had been one of many such stations, a hub for the distribution of seeds and genetic material. But as the centuries turned into millennia, the Shapers had faded, their numbers dwindling as they merged with the very systems they protected. The figure beside her was the last of their kind on this station, a terminal caretaker who had stayed behind to keep the lights burning until someone else arrived to take up the mantle. It was a story of immense loneliness, but also of a quiet, enduring hope. Elaraen felt a deep sense of responsibility settling over her. She looked at her hands, the skin tanned by the light of a dozen different suns, and thought of her garden on the pale wanderer. She was already doing the work of the Shapers in her own small way. She was carrying life through the dark, tending to the growth of things that would otherwise wither in the cold. The strangers seemed to sense her thoughts, a small smile playing at the corners of their mouth. They reached into the folds of their robe and produced a small silver sphere, no larger than a plum. They placed it in Elaraen's hand, and she felt a sudden, sharp prick of heat. The sphere was a seed vault, containing the genetic codes of 1,000 extinct species, a library of life that was now hers to protect. It was a gift of immeasurable value, a legacy that she would carry with her into the deep spaces of the galaxy. As the hours passed, the light in the dome began to dim, transitioning into a simulated twilight. The glowing flowers brightened, their petals pulsing with a soft, rhythmic light that matched the heartbeat of the station. The stranger led Elaraen to a small alcove at the edge of the garden, where a bed of soft, moss-like vegetation waited. There was no need for further explanation. The exhaustion of the journey and the weight of the revelation had left her drained. She lay down, the moss molding to her body, and watched as the stranger returned to their bench by the fountain. They looked like a statue in the fading light, a permanent fixture of the garden. Elaraen closed her eyes, the scent of jasmine and liquid light filling her senses. She felt the pale wanderer through the umbilical, a steady, reassuring presence at the edge of her consciousness. She was no longer just a wanderer, she was a keeper of the flame, a link in a chain that stretched across the eons. In her dreams, she saw the galaxy not as a collection of cold, distant stars, but as a vibrant, living garden. She saw ships like the Pale Wanderer moving through the dark like bees between flowers, carrying the pollen of life to every corner of the universe. She saw the Shapers, their bodies fading into light as they became one with the stars. And she saw herself standing at the center of the Weaver's spire, her hands guiding the liquid light with a new, profound understanding. She was part of something beautiful, something that transcended the short lives of individuals and the rise and fall of empires. The universe was a grand, slow dance, and she had finally found her rhythm. When she awoke, the garden was bathed in the soft, golden light of dawn, and the stranger was gone. In their place on the bench was a single, translucent leaf, its surface etched with the coordinates of another station, another beacon waiting in the dark. Elaraen rose and made her way back to the airlock, the silver sphere tucked safely into a pouch on her suit. The walk through the frozen corridors felt different now. The decay was no longer a sign of failure, but a part of a natural cycle of rest and renewal. She reached the umbilical and stepped back into the Pale Wanderer, the transition feeling like a homecoming. The air inside the ship was sweet and familiar, the hum of the Weaver a welcoming embrace. She sat in the center of the conservatory, the silver sphere in her lap, and watched as the ship detached from the ring. The megastructure slowly receded into the distance, a silent giant guarding its secrets in the shadow of the yellow star. Elaraen looked at the coordinates on the leaf, her mind already beginning to map the path ahead. There were more gardens to find, more legacies to preserve. The long, drifting journey continued, but it had a new destination, a new purpose. She spent the next several days integrating the silver sphere into the ship's systems. The Weaver accepted the new data with a surge of energy, its liquid light turning a vibrant, pulsing green. New plants began to grow in the conservatory, sprouting from the soil with an unnatural speed, their forms strange and beautiful. There were vines that climbed the walls like liquid silver and ferns that unfurled to reveal tiny, glowing fruits. The Pale Wanderer was changing, becoming a more complex, more vibrant version of itself. Elaraen felt the change within herself as well, a sense of clarity and focus that she had never known before. She was no longer just drifting, she was navigating with intent. She set the sails, catching the light of the yellow star, and steered the ship toward the next set of coordinates. The great void lay ahead, but it no longer felt empty. It was a field waiting to be planted, a canvas for the Weaver of gossamer light. As the ship accelerated, Elaraen stood at the observation deck, watching the stars blur into streaks of light. She thought of the stranger in the garden, the last of the Shapers, and wondered if they were still sitting by the fountain, watching the artificial snow fall. She felt a pang of sadness, but it was tempered by the knowledge that their work would continue through her. She was the new caretaker, the new guardian of the garden. And as the Pale Wanderer plunged into the deep dark, she felt a sense of profound peace. The universe was vast and mysterious, but it was also kind. It provided for those who cared for it, and it offered a path for those who were willing to look. She lay back on her bed of silver grass, the scent of the new flowers filling the air, and listened to the hum of the Weaver. It was a song of life and growth, a melody that would carry her to the very edge of the galaxy and beyond. The transition back into the open vacuum was marked by a deepening of the Pale Wanderer's internal resonance, as if the ship itself were digesting the vast library of genetic memories gifted by the Shaper. Elaraen spent the first few cycles in a state of heightened awareness, her senses tightly coupled with the Weaver's expanded consciousness. The silver sphere had integrated not as a mere database, but as a living blueprint that began to alter the ship's very physiology. In the conservatory, the new growth was aggressive yet elegant, translucent vines with the texture of polished jade coiled around the structural ribs of the hull, their leaves acting as supplementary solar collectors that hummed with a low, resonant frequency. The air grew thicker, enriched by the exotic respirations of flora that had not breathed under a natural sun for millions of years. Elaraen found herself spending less time in the library and more time submerged in the sensory tapestry of the garden, her skin beginning to take on a faint, silvery sheen that mirrored the light of the new blossoms. She felt less like a passenger and more like a vital component of the ship's internal ecology, a symbiotic heart beating within a hull of glass and light. The coordinates etched into the translucent leaf led them toward a region of space known in the old charts as the opaque reach, a dense cluster of dark nebulae and ancient stellar remnants that sat like a bruise against the bright center of the galaxy. Navigation here was treacherous. The gravitational currents were erratic, pulled this way and that by the unseen mass of cold, dead stars and the drifting debris of shattered worlds. The Weaver's amber light flickered with a frantic intensity as it processed the incoming data, its liquid core churning with the effort of mapping a path through the gloom. Elaraen sat at the center of the spire, her mind a calm anchor amidst the digital storm. She could feel the weight of the dark nebulae pressing against the ship's shields, a cold, heavy presence that seemed to swallow the light of the pale wanderer's sails. They were moving through a graveyard of solar systems, a place where the cycle of life and death had stalled in the eternal chill of the void. Yet even here, the silver sphere's data pointed toward a hidden vitality, a secret pulse that only those with the right eyes could see. As they penetrated the outer layers of the reach, the visual spectrum began to fail, replaced by the ghost images of the ship's long-range sensors. The stars disappeared, hidden behind curtains of soot and frozen gas that looked like the smoke of 1,000 extinguished fires. To maintain her sense of orientation, Elaraen relied on the tactile feedback of the ship's copper tapestries, which had turned a deep, bruised purple. She could feel the vibration of the hull as it brushed against clouds of microscopic ice, a sound like 1,000 needles scratching against glass. It was a lonely, claustrophobic environment, yet she felt a strange sense of comfort in it. There was an honesty to the dark, a lack of pretension that made the small, bright world of the conservatory feel even more precious. She spent her hours pruning the jade vines, her movements rhythmic and meditative, finding peace in the simple, repetitive tasks of life support. The garden was her universe now, a vibrant bubble of green and gold defying the absolute zero of the exterior world. On the 12th day of their transit through the reach, the Weaver let out a sharp, crystalline chime that vibrated through the entire ship. They had arrived at the first coordinate. Elaraen hurried to the observation deck, but there was nothing to see through the windows but the same impenetrable black. It wasn't until she adjusted the sensors to the deep infrared that the object revealed itself. It was a planet, but not like any she had ever seen. It was a rogue world, cast out of its system long ago, but it wasn't frozen. It glowed with a dull, subterranean heat, its surface a web of glowing red fissures that looked like the veins of a giant heart. The silver sphere's data identified it as a geothermal arc, a world where the Shapers had moved the remnants of a dying biosphere into the planet's crust, using the heat of the core to sustain life in the absence of a sun. It was a world turned inside out, a hidden sanctuary buried beneath kilometers of basalt and ice. The pale wanderer entered a low orbit, the ship's sensors struggling to penetrate the thick, metallic atmosphere of the arc. Elaraen watched the data streams with a mix of awe and trepidation. The planet was screaming with life, but it was a life that had evolved in the dark, adapted to the crushing pressures and the sulfurous heat of the deep crust. The silver sphere began to pulse in her pocket, its light synchronized with the rhythmic flares of the planet's volcanic vents. It was a call and response, a recognition between the seed and the soil. To fulfill her role as the new caretaker, Elaraen knew she would have to descend. She couldn't simply observe from the safety of the ship. She had to deliver the genetic material she carried to the heart of the Ark. The thought of leaving the Pale Wanderer, of stepping onto a world so alien and hostile, filled her with a cold dread, but she suppressed it. The stranger in the ring had trusted her with this legacy, and she would not let it end with her. She prepared a specialized landing pod, a small, egg-shaped craft designed to withstand the extreme temperatures and pressures of the Ark's interior. She filled the pod's small cargo hold with samples from the conservatory, seeds of the lunar lilies, cuttings from the jade vines, and a flask of the liquid light from the Shaper's fountain. As she climbed into the pilot's seat, the Pale Wanderer seemed to groan in protest, the vibrations of the hull reaching a mournful pitch. She placed her hand against the interior wall, whispering a promise to return, and then triggered the launch sequence. The pod detached from the ship with a violent jolt, falling away into the thick, orange haze of the Ark's atmosphere. The descent was a blur of turbulence and heat. The pod's heat shields glowed white-hot as it tore through the metallic clouds, the screaming of the wind rising to a deafening roar. Elaraen gripped the controls, her vision tunneling as the gravitational forces pressed her into the seat, until finally, with a bone-jarring thud, the pod struck the surface and began its long slide into the depths of a volcanic fissure. When the motion finally stopped, the silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the cooling metal. Elaraen checked the external sensors. The pod had come to rest in a massive cavern, kilometers beneath the surface. The temperature outside was a constant 60 degrees Celsius, and the air was thick, with the scent of ozone and wet stone. She opened the hatch and stepped out, her suit's cooling systems immediately kicking into high gear. The cavern was breathtaking, a cathedral of obsidian and basalt illuminated by the glow of the planet's mantle. Giant, translucent mushrooms grew from the walls, their caps as large as houses, shedding a soft, blue spores that drifted through the air like snow. In the center of the cavern lay a vast, subterranean sea of liquid minerals, its surface shimmering with 1,000 different colors. This was the heart of the Ark, the place where the Shapers had planted the final seeds of a billion-year-old dream. As she walked toward the edge of the mineral sea, Elaraen felt a presence watching her. It wasn't the hostile gaze of a predator, but the curious, multifaceted observation of a collective intelligence. From the shadows of the mushroom forest emerged the inhabitants of the Ark, creatures of chitin and light, their bodies shaped like delicate, multi-limbed carousels. They didn't move on legs, but drifted a few centimeters above the ground, propelled by the manipulation of local magnetic fields. They gathered around her in a silent circle, their glowing carapaces pulsing in a complex language of light. Elaraen reached into her pouch and held out the silver sphere. The response was immediate. The creatures bowed their heads, their lights settling into a steady golden glow that matched the weaver's hum. They were the gardeners of this world, the silent sentinels who had waited through the eons for the return of the seed. She spent several cycles in the cavern, working alongside the carousel creatures to plant the new genetic material. They showed her how to graft the jade vines onto the thermal vents, where they could drink the heat of the planet's core, and how to seed the mineral sea with the bioluminescent fish from her ship. It was a labor of love, a slow and careful integration of two different lineages of life. As she worked, she felt the weight of her loneliness beginning to lift. She was no longer a solitary traveler in a dying universe. She was a participant in a grand, ongoing conversation between the stars and the Earth. The Ark was not a tomb, but a womb, a place where life was being nurtured for a future that was yet to come. When the work was finally done, the cavern had been transformed into a vibrant tapestry of green and gold, a testament to the resilience of the Shaper's vision. The departure from the Ark was easier than the arrival. The carousel creatures assisted her in repairing the landing pod, their delicate limbs moving with a precision that surpassed any machine. As she climbed back into the pilot's seat, one of the creatures reached out and touched her visor, leaving behind a faint, glowing mark that looked like a stylized star. It was a blessing, a mark of kinship that would stay with her forever. The pod's ascent was smooth, guided by the planet's own magnetic currents, and within hours she was back in the docking bay of the Pale Wanderer. The ship welcomed her with a surge of warmth, the lavender tapestries turning a bright, joyful yellow. Elaraen returned to the conservatory and collapsed onto her bed of silver grass, the scent of the jade vines filling her lungs. She was exhausted, but her heart was full. She had completed the first of her tasks, and the galaxy felt a little less empty for it. As the Pale Wanderer moved away from the Ark and back into the dark nebulae of the Reach, Elaraen watched the planet fade into the infrared shadows. She knew that the life she had planted there would grow and thrive, protected by the heat of the core and the vigilance of the carousels. She thought of the next set of coordinates on the translucent leaf, a point of light even deeper in the opaque Reach. The journey was far from over, and the challenges ahead would likely be even greater, but she was no longer afraid of the dark. She had seen the fire that burned in the heart of the world, and she knew that as long as there were those willing to tend the flame, the light would never truly go out. She set the sails, catching the faint, cold light of the distant galactic center, and steered the ship toward the next mystery. The weaver of gossamer light was moving on, weaving a new thread into the tapestry of the eons. The ship's internal systems began to hum a new, complex melody, a synthesis of the Pale Wanderer's original programming, and the new data from the Ark. Elaraen listened to the sound, finding a deep resonance in its shifting patterns. It was the sound of evolution, the sound of a world becoming something more than the sum of its parts. She closed her eyes and let the music carry her into a deep, dreamless sleep, the silver mark on her visor glowing softly in the dark. Outside, the dark nebulae swirled and shifted, a silent audience to the passage of the lone, bright ship. The Pale Wanderer was no longer just a wanderer. It was a carrier of futures, a vessel of hope drifting through the sediment of eons toward a dawn that only it could see. The deeper the Pale Wanderer delved into the heart of the opaque Reach, the more the very concept of time seemed to dissolve into a singular, elongated moment of observation. In this region, the density of interstellar dust was so great that it acted as a physical weight against the hull, a velvet pressure that demanded a slow, rhythmic pace of existence. Elaraen moved through the corridors with a deliberate grace, her skin now possessing a permanent, soft radiance that allowed her to navigate the ship even when the internal lights were dimmed to conserve power. The jade vines had become the ship's primary nervous system, their tendrils wrapping around every conduit and structural support, pulsing with a slow, emerald throb that mimicked the respiration of a great, slumbering beast. She had grown to love this intimacy with the vessel. There was no longer a distinction between the gardener and the garden, only a unified entity drifting through a sea of shadow. The air was thick with the scent of damp moss and the sharp, clean tang of the silver grass, creating an atmosphere of permanent spring within the metal shell. As they approached the second coordinate provided by the Shaper's leaf, the Weaver's liquid light began to exhibit a strange behavior, swirling into tight, recursive spirals that mirrored the structure of the dark nebulae outside. The destination was not a planet or a station, but a gravitational anomaly, a point in space where several ancient, collapsed stars had formed a stable, interlocking dance. This was the Well of Remembrance, a place where the light of 1 billion years was trapped in a slow-motion orbit, unable to escape the gravity, but not yet consumed by a black hole. It was a library of photons, a physical record of everything that had ever happened in this sector of the galaxy. Elaraen stood at the observation deck, her eyes adjusting to the subtle shifts in the darkness. Slowly, the well began to reveal itself not as a void, but as a shimmering, translucent sphere of captured light, a ghost star composed of the memories of the universe. The pale wanderer began to decelerate, its sails furling into tight, protective ribbons as it entered the outer shell of the anomaly. The sensation was like being submerged in a warm, glowing liquid. The ship didn't just move through the space, it was absorbed by it. The sensors on the HUD began to flicker with images from the past, the birth of suns, the collision of galaxies, the slow, majestic drift of planets that had long since crumbled into dust. It was a sensory overload of historical data, a flood of light that had been traveling for eons only to be caught in this gravitational net. Elaraen felt a profound sense of vertigo as she watched the history of the Shapers unfold before her eyes. She saw their first ships, elegant needles of light that looked remarkably like the Pale Wanderer, setting out from a world of blue oceans and golden clouds. She saw them planting the first forests on barren moons and weaving the first light sails from the threads of dead stars. It was a lineage of care, a tradition of stewardship that had persisted through the rise and fall of countless empires. She realized then that the well of remembrance was not just a historical archive, but a vital part of the Shapers' ecological network. It was the source of the genetic blueprints she carried, the original template from which all the life in the arcs had been derived. To truly master the silver sphere, she had to align its data with the raw, unfiltered light of the well. She made her way to the Weaver's spire, her heart pounding in her chest. The liquid light was now a brilliant, blinding white, vibrating with the energy of the captured photons. She reached into the core, her hands disappearing into the glow, and felt a sudden, sharp connection to the entirety of the reach. She wasn't just Elaraen anymore. She was the Weaver, she was the Shaper, she was the light itself. The memories of the well poured into her, a tidal wave of information that threatened to wash away her sense of self, but she held onto the memory of the lunar lilies and the taste of the mint water, using the simple, physical realities of her life to anchor her mind. Under her guidance, the Pale Wanderer began to act as a prism, catching the ancient light and refracting it through the conservatory. The plants responded with a burst of growth that was almost violent in its intensity. The lunar lilies tripled in size, their petals turning into wide, luminous sails that drank the historical radiation. The jade vines turned a deep, royal purple, their leaves etching themselves with the same patterns she had seen in the Shaper's garden. The ship was being rewritten, its biological code updated by the very essence of the galaxy's history. Elaraen watched as the copper tapestries in the hallways began to display not her emotions, but the scenes from the well, forests of crystal, oceans of liquid silver, and the faces of beings who had been gone for 10 million years. The Pale Wanderer had become a living museum, a bridge between the forgotten past and the uncertain future. During this period of alignment, Elaraen experienced a state of profound peace that transcended anything she had felt before. She didn't need to eat or sleep in the traditional sense. The energy of the well sustained her, flowing through her veins like a liquid sun. She spent her time wandering the ship, touching the walls and feeling the pulse of the memories. She saw the moments of great triumph, when whole systems were brought back from the brink of extinction, and the moments of quiet tragedy, when a lone gardener watched their world fade into the dark. She understood now that the life she was protecting was not just a collection of cells and DNA, but a collection of experiences and dreams. The preservation of a species was the preservation of a way of seeing the universe. She felt a deep, abiding love for every living thing the Shapers had ever touched, a compassion that spanned the gulf of time. As the alignment reached its peak, a new coordinate began to form in the Weaver's core. It was not a location in space, but a resonance in the frequency of the sails. The final destination was not a place she could find on any map. It was a state of being, a harmonic convergence that would only occur once the Pale Wanderer had visited all the hidden arcs of the Reach. The task was clear. She was to be the pulse that reconnected the scattered sanctuaries, the thread that would sew the garden back together. She felt a surge of determination, a clarity of purpose that burned away the last of her doubts. She was the weaver of gossamer light, and her work was only just beginning. She began the process of extraction, slowly pulling the ship back out of the well's gravitational embrace. The transition was agonizingly slow, as if the anomaly were reluctant to let go of its new passenger, but eventually the pale wanderer broke free, emerging back into the dark nebulae with a hull that shimmered like a diamond. The interior of the ship was forever changed. The conservatory was no longer a collection of separate plants, but a single, integrated forest that breathed with a unified rhythm. The maintenance drones had evolved as well, their metallic carapaces now covered in a thin layer of bioluminescent moss, making them look like floating forest spirits. Elaraen returned to her silver-grass bed, which had grown into a soft, elevated bower overlooking the entire garden. She lay back and watched the stars, or the infrared ghosts of stars, move across the ceiling. She felt a sense of immense patience, a willingness to wait centuries, if necessary, to complete her mission. Time was no longer an enemy to be fought or a resource to be managed. It was the medium in which she worked, the soil in which she planted her dreams. She spent the following weeks preparing for the journey to the remaining arcs. There were dozens of them, hidden in the deepest corners of the Reach, each one a unique experiment in survival. She mapped the routes with the precision of a master weaver, looking for the most efficient paths through the gravitational tides. She felt a new sense of confidence in her abilities. The well of remembrance had given her the knowledge of 1,000 lifetimes, and the Pale Wanderer was now the most advanced vessel in the galaxy, a perfect fusion of ancient wisdom and modern biology. She set the sails, catching the faint, residual glow of the well, and steered the ship toward the next coordinate. The darkness of the opaque Reach no longer felt oppressive. It felt like a blanket, a protective layer under which the secrets of the universe were being kept safe. As they moved away from the well, Elaraen noticed a small, crystalline growth on the windowsill of the observation deck. It was a shard of the captured light, a physical piece of the well that had hitched a ride on the ship. It pulsed with a soft, violet hue, casting a gentle glow over the silver grass. She reached out and touched it, and for a brief second, she saw the face of the stranger from the ring station. They were smiling, a look of profound relief in their nebula-colored eyes. The connection was fleeting, but it was enough to confirm that she was on the right path. She wasn't just carrying seeds, she was carrying the hope of an entire civilization. And as the Pale Wanderer plunged deeper into the heart of the Reach, she knew that she would never be lonely again. She was part of the Weaver's legacy, a single, bright thread in a tapestry that would never end. The ship's internal clocks had long since ceased to matter, replaced by the rhythmic cycles of the jade vines and the pulsing of the silver sphere. Days, weeks, and months blurred into a continuous stream of growth and navigation. Elaraen found herself becoming more and more like the plants she tended, her movements slowing to match the pace of the garden, her thoughts turning toward the long-term needs of the ecosystem. She was a being of patience, a creature of the long dark, finding joy in the smallest signs of life, the unfurling of a new leaf, the birth of a bioluminescent fish, the subtle shift in the ship's hum as it caught a new stellar wind. She was exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. And as the Pale Wanderer moved toward the next hidden arc, she felt a sense of profound, unshakable peace. The universe was wide, and the journey was long, but she had all the light she needed to find her way. The final transit through the opaque Reach felt less like a journey through physical space and more like a descent into the very fabric of the cosmos. The Pale Wanderer had become a radiant beacon, its hull so saturated with the historical light of the Well of Remembrance that it cast a long, shimmering wake across the dark nebulae. Elaraen stood at the center of the conservatory, her presence now entirely synonymous with the ship's vital functions. She no longer felt the need for the silver grass bed. She spent her hours standing or drifting in the center of the spire, her hands submerged in the liquid light of the weaver, which had turned the color of a summer dawn. The genetic material from the silver sphere had fully bloomed, transforming the interior into a cathedral of impossible biology. Trees with crystalline bark rose toward the vaulted ceiling, their branches laden with fruits that tasted of starlight and ancient memories. The jade vines had woven themselves into a dense, protective mesh against the interior hull, providing a layer of organic armor that pulsed with a steady, rhythmic warmth. The ship was no longer a vessel carrying a gardener, it was a garden that had learned how to fly. The final coordinate led them to the very center of the reach, a place where the density of matter was so high that spacetime itself began to curve into a perfect, shimmering sphere. This was the hearth of the Shapers, the original world from which their civilization had sprung. It was not a planet in the traditional sense, but a world ship of staggering proportions, a sphere of living glass and silverwood that enclosed a small, captive sun. As the pale wanderer approached, the great gates of the hearth began to open, sliding apart like the petals of a titanic flower. The light that poured out was blindingly beautiful, a warm, golden radiance that felt like a physical embrace. Elaraen steered the ship into the opening, her heart swelling with a sense of completion. She had reached the end of the thread, the point where the weaver's work was finally finished. The interior of the hearth was a paradise beyond imagining, a world of floating islands and emerald oceans, all meticulously maintained by a collective of caretakers who had stayed behind to wait for the return of the scattered seeds. As the pale wanderer docked with the central spire of the hearth, Elaraen felt a profound change in the ship's resonance. The umbilical bridge that extended to meet them was made of the same silverwood as the conservatory, and the air that flowed through it was identical to the air she had been breathing for centuries. She stepped out of the ship, her bare feet touching the soft, mossy floor of the station. She was met by a group of Shapers, their forms identical to the stranger she had met on the ring, their eyes filled with a quiet, joyful recognition. They didn't speak with words, but through a shared mental resonance that conveyed 1 billion years of gratitude. She had done more than just deliver seeds. She had proven that the Shapers' philosophy of care and stewardship could survive in the face of the infinite dark. She had bridged the gap between the past and the future, ensuring that the garden of the universe would continue to bloom long after the stars themselves had faded. The Shapers led her to the Great Loom, a massive structure at the heart of the world ship, where the genetic codes of all the arcs were being reintegrated into a single, unified tapestry. Elaraen placed the silver sphere into the center of the loom, and she watched as the liquid light began to weave the threads together, creating a map of a new galaxy, a galaxy where every world was a sanctuary, every star a guardian. She realized then that her journey was not truly over, it was merely changing form. She would no longer be a lone wanderer, but a teacher, a guide for the next generation of weavers who would set out from the hearth to carry the light even further into the void. She felt a sense of immense pride, a realization that her life had become a vital part of the universe's own story. She was no longer just Elaraen, she was a part of the infinite, a single, bright stitch in a tapestry that would never be finished. The days that followed were a blur of learning and sharing. She taught the Shapers about the resilience of the jade vines and the beauty of the lunar lilies, and in return, they showed her how to commune with the captive sun and how to weave light into physical matter. The pale wanderer remained docked in the spire, its mission complete, its hull now a permanent part of the hearth's architecture. The conservatory continued to thrive, its plants merging with the flora of the world ship to create a new, even more vibrant ecosystem. Elaraen found herself a small home in a grove of crystalline trees, where she could watch the captive sun rise and set over the emerald oceans. She was surrounded by friends, by peers, by a family she had never known she had. The loneliness that had defined her journey for so long was gone, replaced by a deep, abiding sense of belonging. One evening, as she sat by a fountain of liquid light, she looked up at the stars visible through the hearth's glass ceiling. They were no longer cold, distant points of light, but friends she had visited, worlds she had helped to save. She thought of the rogue planet and the geothermal arc, and she knew that the life she had planted there was growing, reaching upward toward a future she had helped to create. She felt a profound sense of peace, a realization that the universe was exactly as it should be. The cycle of life and death, of growth and decay, was a beautiful, necessary dance, and she was grateful for every step she had taken. The weaver of gossamer light had finally found her rest, but the tapestry she had woven would endure for an eternity, a testament to the power of patience, the beauty of care, and the enduring resilience of the light. As the captive sun dipped below the horizon, casting a long, golden shadow over the garden, Elaraen closed her eyes and listened to the hum of the hearth. It was the same hum she had heard in The Pale Wanderer, but deeper, richer, a symphony of a million voices singing in harmony. She felt herself drifting into a deep, peaceful sleep, her mind filled with visions of new galaxies and new gardens. She knew that when she woke, there would be more work to do, more threads to weave, more light to carry. But for now, it was enough to simply be, to exist in this perfect, golden moment at the center of the world. The journey was over, the mystery was solved, and the garden was whole. The weaver had come home, and the universe was at peace. The legacy of the Shapers was no longer a memory of the past, but a living, breathing reality. The Pale Wanderer had fulfilled its purpose, becoming a bridge between the stars. Elaraen looked at her hands, still glowing with the soft, silver light of the well, and she knew that she was the living embodiment of that legacy. She was a gardener, a weaver, a keeper of the light. And as the stars outside the hearth continued their slow, majestic dance, she knew that the garden would always be tended, the flame would always be kept, and the light would never, ever go out. The tapestry was infinite, and she was a part of it, forever and always, in the heart of the gossamer light.